Good evening, everyone. Really nice to see you virtually. Warmly welcome to Carissa and to Daniel. Today's event is very simple. It's a book presentation. We're hosting it here at the School of Transnational Governance. My name is Alexander Stubb. I'm the director of the school. And we're very honored to have a discussion on, I would say, one of the hottest topics and one of the hottest books in the market at the moment. The book is called Privacy is Power: Why and How You Should Take Back Control of Your Data. And it's been written by Professor Carissa Véliz, who is at Oxford University at the moment. Daniel will introduce her professionally, and I will begin by saying a couple of words about the book itself. But before that, just so you know, we are the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence, and what we try to do is to bring together both academics and practitioners to deal with the most pressing issues globally, whether they are about climate, data, democracy, gender, security, many other issues. And I can tell you that transnationality for us means decision-making beyond the state. We believe that most decisions nowadays, even though there seems to be a backlash in internationalism, are still taken transnationally. And that's what we're trying to figure out, and that's what we teach. We have a wonderful master's program, which has started. I urge all of you online to apply. We also have a wonderful fellowship program. I urge all of you to apply. And as to make the world perfect, we also have 3 professorships that have just been opened in the tender. So if you're in line for that, please apply as well. The book, which I read yesterday, flying from Helsinki, 50 centimeters of snow, to Florence, sunshine, is one of the best books that I have read on the digital revolution, and more specifically on data. I was just telling Carissa there offline that I became a buff and interested in the subject, the World Economic Forum, when it was all about the 4th Industrial Revolution. And having read my Brynjolfssons and McAfee's and Ford's and Tegmark's and many others, I thought that, I know where this argument is. But then I read Carissa's book. And the first thing I did was, Carissa won't like this, sent a WhatsApp to my family and said, you guys need to, A, watch this session today, and B, read the book. This book basically tells you everything that you want to know right now about how data is used in today's world. It's divided into an introduction and conclusion, and in between 6 chapters. Before I say that, if you want to really encapsulate the book, what Carissa says in the book is that it's about the state of privacy today, how the surveillance economy came about, why we should end it, and why we should end trading in personal data, and how to do it. So in many ways, it's about the threats that data might pose on freedom, on equality, on democracy, on autonomy, on creativity, and on intimacy. And for me, it was an eye-opener, not least because the first chapter starts with a wonderful explanation of, this is what happens in terms of data mining in your life when you wake up in the morning. I, by the way, Carissa, wear an Oura ring, which monitors my sleep, my heart rate variability, and the rest of it. So the first thing I do in the morning is snap it on, and that's when the data mining starts. Lots of examples from day-to-day life. The second chapter is, how did we get there? In other words, how did data become such a predominant part of our life? Third one is, about privacy and power, and a really interesting aspect of how to analyze power today. You know, international relations theories look at geopolitics and things, but this looks at why data is power or privacy is power. And I won't reveal the story because Carissa will do that. The fourth chapter is about why data is toxic, why it's like asbestos, as you put it in the book. The fifth chapter is pulling the plug. In other words, how can society end the data mining that's going on? And sixth, and most importantly, what can you do about it? So with these words, I really thank Carissa for coming to this discussion today, and hand it over to Daniel for a brief introduction.
Hi everyone. Introducing Carissa Véliz is easy and short, especially because since anyone who has written a book entitled Privacy is Power will probably not be very interested in having others give too much information about her. I will simply say that she's a philosopher, that she works at the Ethics and Artificial Intelligence Center in Oxford University, and that she has written a wonderful book, something that we will be able to see after today's event. And above all, if you read it, something that I highly recommend. So I reserve some time for my second intervention. Carissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you all for being present. And I'm very, very grateful to both Alexander and Daniel to have organized this. I'm very, very grateful for that. So just a bit of background. I'm a philosopher, and I started to get interested in privacy as a result of researching my own family. My own family were refugees from the Spanish Civil War, and the Spanish Civil War was always a taboo at home. It was something that you couldn't really talk about at all. So when the oldest generation died, I decided to go into the archives and research whatever I could find about them. And I thought I would maybe be lucky to find their names or something. And instead I found a whole lot about them, and a lot that they had never told us. So I learned, for instance, that my grandfather had been the youngest tenured professor in philosophy, and I didn't even know he had studied philosophy. So for me, that was like a huge revelation. I learned that he had been in prison, that he had almost married a different woman from my grandmother, and all these secrets. And I started questioning whether I had a right to know these things, whether I had a right to tell my mother about them, and whether I had a right maybe to write about these issues and publish about this. And just that summer, Edward Snowden revealed that we were being surveilled at a mass scale, and that had a huge impact on me. So being a philosopher, I looked to philosophy to find some answers. And I was very unsatisfied with what I found. Much of it was quite old and didn't really reflect the realities of the internet. And even the ones that were more recent, it just seemed that we were missing a lot as philosophers in this discussion, and that we should have a more proper debate. There is no roles of privacy like there is for justice. So it seems like it's such a big topic, and we were not taking part in it. So I decided to write my dissertation on privacy. I changed the topic. I had already started, and I decided to change. And I've been researching the topic for about 6 or 7 years. And the plan, as with most philosophers, was to write an academic book. But too many things were happening, and I was too frustrated with the state of affairs. And I hadn't found that book that I wish I could have read when I first got interested in privacy, that just told you things how they were, directly, short, to the point, no nonsense kind of thing. And it just seemed to me that it was much more urgent to do that than to complete the academic project, which I will complete. But I had this urgency that, we're in the middle of the data economy, so much is happening. It's really changing the way we do politics, the way we debate public issues. And it seems to me that most people are hugely misinformed and ill-informed about these topics, and not because of their own fault, but just because it's really hard to figure out what the hell is going on, because companies have a great interest in people not knowing about it. So I tried to write the book that I wish I could have read. And it's a book that's very short, and it doesn't like waste time kind of beating around the bushes. I feel very strongly about privacy because I feel that it's something that's very dangerous. Not to have enough privacy in a society is really dangerous, and that we're treading very delicate grounds, and we're kind of sleepwalking in a situation that can be extremely bad for our future. And it tries to explain the relationship between privacy and power, which is something that hasn't been done before. And it seems to me that we haven't thought enough about power in these times. We are used to certain kinds of power, but we're seeing new kinds of power that are taking us by surprise. And the lack of understanding of that power has led us to allow, for instance, social media to develop in ways that have been toxic to society. So the first chapter goes through a day in a live person, and just to illustrate really how much data we're losing. And even though I wrote this chapter and obviously I researched this topic, every time I have to reread it for whatever reason, I'm still surprised. And that shows that data is so abstract that we're just not the kinds of creatures that are meant to understand this kind of thing. It's just not tangible enough for us. And companies and governments have really profited from that fact that it's so hard to understand data. It's too abstract, it's too invisible, it's too intangible. But to give you a few examples that caught my attention, for instance, if you have a smart car, the moment you get into your car, all kinds of things are being measured that you wouldn't imagine. For instance, your weight is being measured by the seat under you. And that data can be sold to insurance companies, to all kinds of people who might want to know whether you're getting fat or not, or whether you're getting too slim. Obviously, where you go, how fast you drive, but also things like the kind of music you like to listen to. And bankers are interested in that because they think they can infer your mood from that. And whether you're getting depressed might be an important piece of information regarding whether you might pay back a loan or not. And your phone is so incredibly sensitive that it can measure things that are very surprising, and things can be inferred that you wouldn't believe. So for instance, companies can infer how fast or slow you walk, and on the basis of that, try to figure out how long you're going to live, or whether you're drunk or not, or all kinds of things that are just not very direct. And in fact, often I get the question like, what was the most surprising thing that you found out? And unfortunately, it's something that I was so scared about and so spooked that I decided not to publish it, because it's just so easy for somebody to abuse it and to find anyone in the world they want, and to potentially use that to harm that person, that I decided it wasn't a good idea to publish it. But the fact that I'm just a philosopher, I'm not particularly tech savvy, and could find that so easily, it just tells us that we are really sitting on a ticking bomb, and we should be really careful about that. So that's the first chapter. It's kind of a narrative. The second chapter tries to explain how this came about. It seems like this is a terrible idea, and if today, like 50 years ago, we would have asked just anyone, hey, do you think we should develop this data economy and buy and sell people's personal data, and this is how things are going to work? We would have probably said, no, that's insane. So how did we let it happen? And I argue that there were a few elements involved. One of them that was very important, it was Google's discovery and development that personal data could be used to sell advertisements. And the theory of it is really good. Is nobody wants to see ads that they don't care about. So if you don't want to buy a tractor, you don't want to see tractors passing by your screen. And in the same way, tractor companies don't want to show their ads to people who will never buy a tractor. So it seems like a really good idea for companies to show us exactly what we want. But there is a kind of hidden assumption there that we need to know everything about a person to show them the right ad, which I challenged later on in the book. But anyway, so Google found this out and kind of developed it to a degree that nobody else had developed it. And that became the kickoff of the data economy. A second element that was really important was 9/11. Before 9/11, the US Congress, well, the Federal Trade Commission had written a report for the US Congress arguing that this data economy was not a good idea, that we should regulate it, along the terms, it's very similar to the GDPR. You know, people should know what data companies have on them. They should be able to correct any mistakes. They should be able to delete that data, etc. And a few months later, 9/11 happened, and that changed everything, because governments, in particular the US government, felt ashamed that they couldn't stop that attack. And they vowed to do everything and anything possible to make sure that that couldn't happen again, even though that's a very unrealistic objective. And in the pursuit of that objective, they decided that they could literally make a copy of the data that was being gathered, and with the hopes that that might stop terrorism. So in the book, there are more details, but the short of it is that it just turns out that big data is not the kind of method that is good at catching terrorists. Big data is very good at analyzing kind of patterns in huge troves of data. So it's very good at analyzing what you're going to buy, because there are billions of people buying things every single day. But it's not very good at finding a very rare kind of event like terrorism, which will always be rare. No matter how much data we could have had and how surveilled the population was, nobody could have figured out that somebody would use a pot to commit an attack on the Boston Marathon, say, or that somebody would use a truck to run into people. That's just not the kind of thing that can be predicted through big data. So that's the second element that was very important in how the data economy came about. The governments found that they could make a copy of the data. They found that to be very useful, or they hoped it would be useful, and they therefore didn't regulate the data economy the way they might have regulated it had 9/11 not happened. And then the third element was this idea that privacy is obsolete. It's something that has to do with the past, but it's not useful anymore. And of course, this narrative is incredibly convenient to companies, to tech companies in particular. For instance, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg famously argued that we had evolved privacy norms. And of course, a few years later, he changed his tune when other companies changed their point of view. And there was this idea that, you know, privacy was important in the past, but is just no longer relevant. And we are finding out now that it's just as relevant as in the past, if not more. And the kind of bad effects that we had in the past are still here. It's just more invisible. So for instance, if you went and looked for a job maybe 40 years ago, and the interviewer asked you if you plan to have kids anytime soon, it was kind of very obvious how the answer to that question might jeopardize your being hired or not. And that's why we made it illegal. And it was very obvious what the other person was searching for. So everything was very tangible. Today, you leave your name here, your age there, you give a company some data about what you're looking for, something about what you read, your browsing history. 6 months from now, you apply for a job. 8 months from now, you get rejected, and you'll never make the connection that those data points actually told that company that you're planning to have kids. And that company wants to hire somebody who doesn't plan to have kids in the near future. And the perverse thing is that you'll never know about it, because nobody's going to explain to you why you got rejected. And it's very hard to police this kind of discrimination. It's almost impossible to police it. So the best we can do is actually to make sure that those companies don't get access to that data, so that they cannot discriminate even if they wanted to. The third chapter is an explanation about what the relationship is between privacy and power, and it's quite long, so I'm just going to summarize maybe just some of the points that I find more interesting. I take this analogy from Bertrand Russell, the philosopher Bertrand Russell, who argued that we should think about power as energy. And one of the characteristics of energy is that it can transform itself from one kind into another. With power, it's the same thing. If you have enough economic power, if you have enough money, you can transform that into political power. If you have enough political power, you can transform it into military power, and so on. And we're used to these kind of very traditional powers. Economic, political, military. But in the digital age, there's this other kind of power that took us by surprise. And that's the power related to personal data. And it's a power that has to do with the ability to forecast things and to influence people's behavior. And this kind of power has always been there in a sense. ever since Francis Bacon, we know that knowledge is a kind of power, for example, but we had never had so many tools to analyze data to this degree and so much data to analyze. So in fact, what could have been a change in degree is really a change of, in essence. And what I argue is that these companies like Google and Facebook, got a hold of a lot of data at the beginning of the digital age, and that made them incredibly powerful. And they have transformed that power in economic power, of course, but also in political power. And when we talk about personal data, sometimes we get too distracted by the fact that, yes, personal data can be sold and that makes it valuable. But it's even more valuable because it gives companies and people power. And power is much more valuable than money in a way, because it can be transformed into money if they want, but it can be transformed into other things as well. To the point to which, if you have enough power, you can get away with anything, including breaking the law. And so far that has, pretty much happened. So we should pay more attention to this new kind of power. And one of the implications is that, for instance, when we analyze whether a company is a monopoly or not, we shouldn't just analyze it through the traditional litmus test, which is, a company is a monopoly if it can increase its price without losing customers. But of course, companies like Google are, in theory, free. But the general principle should be something like, a company is a monopoly when they can impose exploitative practices on their customers, whether it be through price or through, for instance, gathering too much data or whatever else might be, without losing customers. I also offer a reflection about how knowledge and power interact with privacy. And I use Foucault here to explain that it's not only that knowledge is a kind of power, in that the more you know about someone, the more you can forecast what they're going to do and try to influence it and understand them and so on. That's true, but it's also, the reverse is also true, in that knowledge is power and power is knowledge. The idea is that part of why a company like Google is so powerful is because they get to decide what counts as knowledge, and they get to decide what counts as knowledge about you in particular. So when, say, you're searching through Google, and Google is using this thing that's called real-time bidding, and that means that you search in Google, and all these companies are fighting each other to try to show you ads. And the way that gets done is your personal data gets transferred to those companies before you consent to it. And this is incredibly sensitive data including your sexual orientation, your political tendencies, your age, gender, all kinds of things. And then say, you search for shoes yesterday on Amazon. And so Amazon is particularly interested in showing you shoes again and in reminding you that you have bought those shoes. So they decide that they want to pay more than the others in order to show you that ad. But the point is that the company who decides what counts as knowledge about you, who is determining for all purposes and effects, what is your sexual orientation, what's your political tendency, how much purchasing power you have, and all of that, is Google. And we're not having enough of an influence in what gets to count as knowledge about us. And there's also an interesting plane in knowledge and power, in that the less we know about these companies and the more they know about us, the more powerful they are over us. So one of the things that I argue in the book is that we need to know more about them so that we can have more power, but we also need to make sure that they know less about us to kind of balance the asymmetry of power that we have been involved in recent years. Later on in the chapter, I talk about the importance of autonomy, and autonomy is basically the ability and right to self-govern yourself. And that also has implications for politics, because we also care about the self-governing of people, of the citizenry. And for the citizenry to be self-governed, individuals need to be self-governed as well. And one of the concerning aspects of the data economy is the attempt to sway elections. And of course, the most illustrative example is Cambridge Analytica and how they tried to sway various elections around the world. And even if there's a debate about to what extent they were successful or not. And though that question is important, it's also a matter of whether they should even be allowed to try. And at the moment, there are hundreds of companies like Cambridge Analytica trying it, and we're allowing them still. And one of the arguments for why they might have not been successful is that the kind of changes that companies can have through showing content and ad that is personalized is not that big. It's unclear exactly what's the number, but between 1% and 4% of change, whether it's buying more clothes or whatever it is, or voting differently. And in the case of commercial enterprises, that's enough to make a little bit of a profit, although ads personalized are so expensive that it might not be worth it. But in the case of politics, even 1% can make all the difference. There are so many elections that are won and lost on the basis of a few hundred or a few thousand votes that it's incredibly dangerous to tempt our fate, essentially. Sorry. And in the book, I describe how, as the data economy currently stands, what's going on is that there are data avatars of you. So literally, data scientists have building a model of you that is like a little voodoo doll, and they play with it. So they show you one ad and see how you react in like the virtual world. And then when they get it right, when they get the reaction that they want, then they try it on you for real. And depending on how you react or not, they tweak the voodoo doll. And they plan to have, like, the idea is to have like a model society with which they can play to try to sway things their way, whether it's, they want to make a particular company more popular or whether they want to make a particular candidate more popular. And either way, it's very questionable whether this has any benefit to society at all, and the risks seem pretty steep. So chapter 4 is about how personal data is toxic. Up until now, we have thought about personal data mostly as an asset. And that makes sense because we've learned that it can be very profitable. But I argue that we should think about personal data as something like asbestos. Asbestos is an interesting analogy because it's a very useful material. It's very cheap to mine and easy to mine. And it helps things not going up into flames. So it's very useful to build things, and we put it everywhere. We put it in walls, in roofs, in plumbing, in cars, in aerosols, in all kinds of things. And then we learned that it's actually really toxic, that there's no self-threshold of exposure, and hundreds of thousands of people die every year from cancer due to asbestos. And personal data is similar in the sense that it's very cheap to mine, it's very helpful, it's very profitable, but it's actually really, really dangerous. And I argue that personal data can poison individuals, institutions, and society. Individuals get poisoned by getting exposed to data harms. So those can range from being discriminated against for a job application or a loan application or an apartment application, to paying more for the same product than other people are paying, and to things like extortion. So there have been many cases now, and every year we see new cases. Actually, one of the latest cases was from Finland. I don't know if you heard about this, Alexander, about a clinic that lost some data and people got extorted for it. There was a similar case for a clinic in, I believe it was Estonia, and they had clients from all over the world. And in the end, 25,000 records got exposed. And these were nude pictures, passports, really sensitive data. In a recent survey that I carried out with a colleague, Sean Brooks, we found that about 92% of people have had some kind of bad experience related to privacy online. And again, this varies a lot from identity theft to things like being the target of spyware. And the more we accumulate bad experiences, the more individuals are aware of how, okay, so privacy is not old, it's not obsolete, and the kind of things that we used to guard ourselves against, we still have to guard ourselves against. So things like getting our money stolen or getting our physical security jeopardized and so on. So that's kind of individual exposure and how it can poison individuals. And sometimes, you don't not have to do anything bad for it, because there's this myth that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, kind of thing. But there have been so many people whose lives have been destroyed by privacy violations, who have done nothing wrong at all. They just got their identity stolen, and now they have to go around courts trying to prove that they're innocent. And that's something that's really expensive and really hard to do, and that can really destroy your life. But personal data also destroys institutions. It's not only the case that every personal data point is a liability, is a potential lawsuit, a potential data breach. It's also a huge loss of face when it happens. So when the US government lost millions of records of their employees, that was a huge loss of face. And not only did it jeopardize people who were secret agents and undercover agents and so on, but it also showed that the US government cannot keep its data safe. And that makes it look very weak with respect to other countries. So in this kind of global setting in which we have two superpowers like Russia and China who are really good at hacking, it's just totally reckless to have a data economy that collects as much data as possible and just stores it for as long as possible. And finally, personal data can intoxicate or poison societies. And there are many ways in which this can happen, but I'll just talk about a few. One of the main tenets of the book is that privacy is collective. This myth about it being personal or individual is completely misleading. And here's an example. So if you make an online DNA test, because say you're interested in your ancestry and you want to know whether your grandparents were from, I don't know, wherever, from Italy or wherever. When you expose yourself, you're also exposing your siblings, your parents, your children, but also very distant kin who you might never meet, but who can have really bad consequences from it. So there have already been cases of people being deported, for instance, on the basis of genetic tests that other people around the world have done. Every time you expose yourself, you expose others, because we're connected in ways that make us vulnerable to each other. So not only are you an individual, but you're somebody's sister, you're somebody's mother, you're somebody's friend, you're somebody's neighbor, you're somebody's barber, you're somebody's lawyer. And part of why companies want access, for instance, to your contacts is because we are connected in this networked way. And again, with the Cambridge Analytica example, only 270,000 people actually consented to Cambridge Analytica using their data and filled out the survey. And from that, Cambridge Analytica could have access to 87 million people's data. And with that, they created a tool to profile any voter in any of these countries. So not only does our individual data contain data about other people, but also whenever we have losses of privacy, we face them collectively, we suffer them collectively, just like the ecology. So even if you're impeccable with your privacy, if your friends are not, you have no chance, absolutely no chance. So we really have to take care of each other. In a sense, this is a collective effort that we have to engage in. There are at least two other ways in which privacy can poison societies. One is that it poisons democracy, partly by poisoning equality. So you and I are not being treated as equals online. Even if we lived in the same country, we wouldn't be treated as equals. We are treated on the basis of our data. And whether you're a man or, for instance, if you're a man, you will get shown ads for higher paying jobs than I will. We will get different content depending on where we live and whether we have a Mac or a Windows laptop, whether we have searched for one thing or another. We are not being treated as equals anymore. But it also jeopardizes democracy in the ways that we talked about and that many other people have talked about. It just fractures the public sphere so that we don't get to see the same news anymore. We get this personalized access to the world, and because we don't have unmediated access to the world, we just see it through our screens. And if our screen is completely different from your neighbor, then whenever you talk to your neighbor, you're going to both think that both of you are insane, or that the other is insane. And it doesn't occur to us that actually they're just getting a very different story about the world. And finally, it's really having this treasure trove of personal data is incredibly dangerous for national security. There are many stories that are relevant here, but I'll share a couple. One is the Strava story, in which, Strava is this app that people use to run and or to bike. And it turns out like military personnel, like most other people, tend to run near where they live and work. And so Strava had the brilliant idea of publishing their routes. There it is, Alexander has it. You seem to have all the gadgets. So as Strava published the map of people's routes, and it was there for months, and then somebody realized that if you looked really carefully, you could infer the military bases of the US that were supposed to be secret. And the way you infer it was, there were very few people running around those areas. They seem to be in the middle of nowhere. You triangulate with Google Maps and it's all blurred. And then it doesn't take a genius to figure out that there's a secret military base there. So that's just one example. Another example is how a couple of journalists from the New York Times tried to find the president of the United States through data that they got from data brokers. So anybody can do this. And it didn't take them long, and they're not tech savvy, they're not like geniuses. And it didn't take them long to figure out who was a secret agent who was following around the president. You correlate with the schedule, and just anyone can know the location of the president of the United States through phone location. And if the president of the United States is not safe, then who is? And in a way, we are all unsafe through our politicians and our military personnel and so on. And finally, a very important story that I think we should learn from is the Second World War. One of the first things that the Nazis did when they invaded a city was go to the registry, because that's where the data was held. So there is a really interesting study comparing the country in Europe that had the most data, which was the Netherlands, versus the country in Europe that has the least personal data collected, which was France. And France had made a conscious decision not to collect certain kinds of data. In 1872, they decided that for privacy reasons, they wouldn't collect data related to religious affiliation. Versus the Netherlands, in which there was a guy called Lenz who was a fan of statistics. He developed the first ID card. He was a pioneer in population statistics, and he wanted to design a system that would follow people from cradle to grave. And that's a direct quote. And the result was that the Nazis could find and kill about 75% of the Jewish population. And in France, they found and killed about 25% of the Jewish population. And this difference is in the hundreds of thousands of people. There is a particularly instructive story about the Amsterdam registry. A resistance cell in 1943 decided to destroy the registry before the Nazis got to it in order to try to save as many people as possible. They went into the registry, they set fire to the records, and they had a deal with the fire department because they had some colleagues there. And the fire department agreed that they would arrive late and that they would use as much water as possible to destroy as many records as possible. Unfortunately, they were incredibly unsuccessful. They only managed to destroy about 10 to 15% of records, and they got caught and killed for doing this. And the Nazis found about 70,000 Jews in Amsterdam. And the lesson is twofold. First, the Dutch had collected too much data, more data than they needed. And secondly, they didn't have an easy way to delete the data in case of an emergency. And we are making both mistakes at a scale never seen before. And that should give us a reason to think about it twice. So the end of the book is, how do we get out of this mess? In short, we need regulation. There's no way around it. But for regulation to happen, we need to pressure our politicians and our companies. So in terms of regulation, we can talk more about it in the Q&A if we want, but I don't want to go too long anymore. So in a nutshell, we have to ban the trade in personal data. We have to implement fiduciary duties such that there's always a duty of care to whoever wants to collect or manage personal data. Just like, if you want to be a doctor, you have to accept certain kinds of responsibilities and duties of care. It's not enough to want to open people up and see what they have inside. In the same way, if you want to collect and manage personal data, then you have to agree to only use that data for the benefit of data subjects and never against them. And if you don't want to take on that responsibility, well, look for another job. And we should also ban personalized content the advantages that we get from it are very, very few. We can get them in other ways, and the disadvantages are huge. So for instance, if we want personalized ads, we don't need to know whether somebody's gay or straight, fat or slim, rich or poor, white or black, in order to show them shoes. We only want to know that they're looking for shoes. So if you go onto Google and look for shoes, sure, let's show people ads of shoes, but we don't need to know all these things about them that are incredibly sensitive in order to do that. We should also make sure that we have minimum standards for cybersecurity. At the moment, it's like a disaster, and there are no incentives to have cybersecurity, and that makes us all unsafe. Just like we knew a pandemic was coming, and we've known it for decades, we know that a massive cyber attack is coming. And in fact, there have been attempts during this pandemic. So just imagine being in lockdown and having a massive cyber attack in which all the power goes down and the internet goes down. It could be like truly terrifying and very realistic and very, very dangerous for our country. So we need to improve our cybersecurity. And the last chapter is what you can do as an individual. Again, in a nutshell, just try your best. You don't have to be perfect. And in fact, you won't be perfect, but that doesn't matter. It matters more that you try than anything else, because you might be surprised. Governments and companies are really listening, and they really care about what people think. And they're very sensitive to changes. So like people now leaving WhatsApp and going to Signal is really, really significant, and it really makes a difference. So just as an example. So just cultivate a culture of privacy. Don't force others to expose more than they want. Don't upload photos of others without asking for their consent. Don't record them. Don't retweet or pass on messages that violate someone's privacy. Try to choose privacy-friendly options. So instead of using Google, use DuckDuckGo. It's really good. It's free. It doesn't collect your data. Instead of using WhatsApp, use Signal. Instead of using Gmail, use ProtonMail. And just try your best. And there are many things that you can do, and there's a lot of advice in the book. And I hope you go and read the book, and I hope it's helpful. And I hope we can talk about it now and further into the future.
Thank you very much, Carissa. That was brilliant, as was the book. As I said, I think it's one of the best books that I've read, not only on the subject, but in general. It was fascinating. It was interesting. It was, these books are not supposed to be page turners, and it was.
Thank you.
Your fault in that sense. Great. Now we're going to go into Q&A session, and I'll post the first question. Daniel can do the second one, and then I'll start going through the questions there. If it's agreeable with you, I think we might want to go over time a little bit. If you have the time, we'd probably push it to say 6:15 local, so that's 5:15 your time. Now, of course, I sort of scratch my head as a former public figure, and I remember when I became foreign minister, I was immediately told by the security, whatever you do will be followed by the Russians, by the Chinese, by the Americans. So I've been living very much by the motto that if you have nothing to hide, don't hide anything. And now I'm sort of confronted with this data minefield where I realize that, things can actually go really sour if I'm not careful with it. Now, what would be your recommendation to EU regulators when they're confronting the American government and American tech giants, rather topical issue at the moment, and China and its sort of social protocols and social apps? Should we take the lead in this? And if so, what should we do in terms of regulation?
So I do think we should take the lead. And like as an example, just the GDPR was an incredible thing. Before the GDPR happened, even like 2 years before it happened, nobody thought it was possible. Everybody ridiculed it. It was really like a very different kind of environment. And the GDPR changed everything. And it's very imperfect. And we need something much, much better. But it was a miracle. And it changed the conversation. And other countries followed. Japan followed. And the United States has become much more aware of privacy. I mean, California followed. And we are already like hearing debates about whether the US is going to have a federal privacy law. So that's an example of how leading does work, and it does change the conversation. At the same time, we need to be very careful to have more allies. And I'm hopeful that with Biden now, and who's someone who seems to be much more open to a cooperation than Trump, we can form again an alliance between Western countries to kind of face China, because China has a very different approach to privacy, one that is becoming increasingly totalitarian. And we shouldn't buy this narrative that the only way to compete with China is just to liberalize data and to continue selling data, because it's false. First, it's going to further put us at risk, because our personal data will be there to hack, and they will hack it. So like, this risk is not taken seriously enough. And secondly, because developing AI doesn't necessarily need that much data. In fact, one of the things that I argue is that good AI will need a lot less data. If you compare a child to, say, Alexa or one of these digital assistants who are pretty stupid, a child, you tell them something once or twice or 3 times and they get it. And not only do they get it, they can generalize and apply it to different things. And at the moment, AI needs to get like hundreds of thousands of examples to get it. And the more we refine AI, the less data we will need. So we shouldn't buckle under the pressure that we should just give up our data to make science progress, because that's not necessarily true.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the answer. I will leave a final bonus question about Trump and being banned from Twitter, but that's not data related, but we'll have that as a final question. I now hand it over to Daniel, who'll post the next question, and then I'll start going through. I see 8 questions coming from the public so far. Daniel, please go ahead.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Carissa. I had many questions to ask you. I'm looking forward to ask you personally in Florence when the time and the possibility we will have in the future. I have only a question to ask you. I would like to know your opinion about the possibility to set up trade-off between disclosure of personal data and the benefits of digital services. I mean, using machine learning techniques and adaptive systems to identify individuals' preferences and set their specific level of privacy. The problem is that in this case is the paradox that more data would need to be collected from individuals to determine their privacy expectations. To my view, the underlying problem is that the data which the market relies to determine the privacy desired by the users underestimates their privacy aspirations, for the simple reason that there is more data from those inside the market than from those outside the market, or who do not accept that data disclosure in exchange for services. In my view, digital companies have a biased view of the privacy desired by all people, which is different from that accepted for their users. This underestimation ends up reducing the general level of privacy for everyone. This is one of the aspects that highlights the extent to which privacy is not adequately valued by the market and should therefore be considered as a public good, as you remarkably said in the book.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And here's a personal story to just illustrate it. A few months ago, I was going to carry out a survey about privacy. And I got some advice about how to do this. And the advice that I got was, go with this company, they're the best. And it turns out that the company in question was incredibly bad with privacy. So like for somebody to answer the survey, they would have to give their phone number, their DNA, their ID, their national ID card, their home address, like all these things. And obviously, the person who is willing to give that is going to think that privacy doesn't matter at all. So that survey is going to be completely biased, and biased very conveniently towards companies, right? Because companies want people to say that privacy doesn't matter. So what we should do, and this is something else that I propose in the book, so I really welcome the question because it allows me to talk about this, is that the default should be no data collection. You should have to effortfully opt in for data collection to happen. And even then, only certain kinds of data collection should be allowed to happen. Just like in medicine, we don't allow anything to happen, even if both people agree. So say, you know, I want to be infected with coronavirus because I just want to feel what's it like. And I go into a hospital and ask a doctor to do that. They're not going to do that, even if they're, you know, interested in seeing like how I react. The law doesn't allow that, right? So we shouldn't allow certain kinds of personal data things that are going on. That just so, for instance, at the moment, data brokers are literally earning money from selling data lists about who has been a rape victim. Like, how is that helpful, and how is that legal? So we shouldn't allow certain things to happen. And for those that we should allow, then it should be on an opt-in basis as opposed to opt-out.
That's an excellent answer as well. You know, when you're talking this, there's one thing I did forget. Are you sure you don't want to tell you what you did not publish in the book?
Yeah, that's scary.
Yeah, good. We'll leave it there. So, okay, what I'll do, Carissa, now is I'll take 2 questions at a time, and if you can attack both of them. The first one is regarding data governance and taking back control. What is your view on blockchain-based identity applications as tools for safeguarding individual privacy? What implementation challenges do you expect in the near future? So blockchain is the first one. And the second question is from someone, Melina Mayas, who has read your book over Christmas and said, felt overwhelmed. Thanks for hitting the truth, with a smiley. And then she asks, can you please comment on the recent WhatsApp privacy concerns connecting all our data with Facebook? What do you think is the future of Facebook? How can we as users push these companies to do better? You've answered part of it, but I think the question is worth highlighting. So blockchain and Facebook.
Blockchain, not too optimistic. Basic reason is that because it creates literally a track of everything that's been done, it's fairly easy, or at least possible, to trace back each action to a particular person. And so it's not a very good privacy preserving tool. I'm more optimistic about things like differential privacy, even though there's a lot to be developed and it's still not usable for most companies and most institutions. And I write about it in the book, but there are other methods that are also becoming really interesting, like homomorphic encryption. So I'm more optimistic about those. About WhatsApp and Facebook, so it's an interesting case because the privacy policy wasn't that different from what there was before. The main changes are that Facebook wants to allow people to have more interaction with companies. And I think people reacted in the way they did for 2 reasons. One is that it's incredibly invasive, but it was already invasive before. But it just reminds you of how invasive it is. And it reminds you of how forceful it is, because it's either you accept this or you can't use WhatsApp, period. There's no negotiating, no option. It's just take it or leave it. And I think that how do we push these companies to do better? We leave them. I mean, that's really effective in a sense. We shouldn't have to leave them. We should regulate them. But as users, it makes a statement when so many people are leaving WhatsApp and Signal that it's on the news. You can bet that WhatsApp is listening.
Private question, are you on Facebook or are you on WhatsApp? I think I know the answer.
So I'm on everything, but I use Signal most of the time, and I try to push people to use Signal. Every once in a while, I'm pushed to using WhatsApp, and I bite the bullet. I'm not happy about it. And again, I don't think we should be like super radical about this. We should make the best effort we possibly can, but it's just not realistic to assume that, you know, if the only way you can communicate with a business is through WhatsApp, then you shouldn't communicate with that business at all. Sometimes it's really important, and the onus should be in the government to regulate it properly.
This is why I think I know the answer to the next question, which I was going to pose as a bonus, but because it's come from Jose Hernandez. He asks, what do you think of the Trump case and the suspension of his Twitter account. Several governments have expressed their annoyance. They see it as a threat to the state. So this is obviously a lead to your answer. It had happened if it had happened with citizens, but not with presidents, and now they're worried. What do you think?
It's a really interesting case, and it's a case of something that happened that shouldn't have happened at all, like from a long time ago. It just shows like how bad of a moment we're living through. It shouldn't have happened in the first place, because we should have regulation that people can agree on, and they're international standards, and it shouldn't come from a particular platform. What's concerning is that it comes from Twitter, because right now I think it's the right thing to do, and they should have like shut Trump up long ago, right? Trump has been saying outrageous things and really dangerous things for a long time. So this has been building up, and they have allowed it, and now they have banned it. I mean, now that Trump is about to lose power and they have nothing to lose, that now they ban him. It's better than them not banning it, because it's so dangerous and there could be real violence. But private companies shouldn't be the ones making these decisions, but they have to at the moment, because we don't have the right structure. And it just shows that we're in the Wild West, and we need to change that fast if we're going to keep democracies strong. Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. I put a sequence of 3 tweets out on this morning, and it did generate quite an active debate. And I must say a very constructive one, for and against. And it was really nice to see that people actually can still converse about these difficult issues. But, I came to the line as well that it was a little bit different. I was happy that he was banned, but I do not think that it's up for tech platforms to decide the limits of free speech, and therefore it needs to go first through regulation and then the ultimate decision coming from the judiciary system. But the world is a much nicer and more peaceful place without the tweets from Trump. Next question: which language is your book going to be available in? Are you planning to translate it? Bonus question: I assume you're not going to use Google Translate to do that. No. So it's going to be published in Spanish with Debate in autumn. And then if anybody else has ideas, then email me.
There you go. So you should be contacting. I'm sure I have a feeling that for those of you who don't know, The Economist ranked it as one of the best books of 2020. And I do think that this is potentially a book that is going to go viral if a physical book can go viral, and that will probably mean a lot of translation as well. Policy question from Joseph. I haven't read this first, so I'll just read. Taking the collective approach of data privacy, toxicity by interdependence and accumulation. Can data privacy be considered a public good from the governance point of view? If so, is GDPR in Europe a fitted policy provision of such a public good? So that's the policy question.
Yeah, I think we can think of privacy as a public good. And I think the GDPR was a very important step in the right direction, but definitely not enough. So I think the default should have to be not collection of data, and people have to opt in. And I think that certain kinds of data practices should be outlawed, that they aren't at the moment. And we need to better fund agencies so that they can police this better. At the moment, like there's so many companies not complying adequately. And there are also a lot of loopholes in the way people interpret legitimate interests. So at the moment you can collect data either by consent or by legitimate interest. And it's very unclear what this means and to what extent, like what this covers. So it's inadequate. We need to end the data economy. Just personal data shouldn't be the kind of thing that you can buy or sell. And to have an economic system or a business model that depends on the massive violation of rights is just totally unacceptable. And we have to get rid of it. And the GDPR doesn't get rid of it. And clearly, like we've had so many scandals lately, and it shows that it's not enough. But it was very important and a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think one of the key elements here is also our personal behavior. I mean, I do not remember reading once the terms and agreements of any type of a button that I've been pushing. And the stuff that is hidden in there in terms of data collection is beyond. So then, of course, someone can use the argument, well, you signed on to it, but it's a different story. Same from Joseph, also a sort of a political philosophy question, if you will. What is the attitude governance ought to take when dealing with something like data? So unknown potentialities for good and bad. Should we always take the worst case scenario as a reference point, for example, Nazis? And how do we do a cost-benefit analysis of something that we don't know? Complicated question, but you're a philosopher.
Complicated question. And we need to get more sophisticated with how we deal with risk. One important thing is whether the kind of risk we are dealing with follows a normal distribution or not. And in cases in which it doesn't follow a normal distribution, and that means that you can have outliers that are hugely catastrophic, like with a pandemic, with an earthquake, or with a potential massive cyber attack, or a potential genocide from data, from personal data, there's no way to forecast when that's going to happen or if it's going to happen. And the best we can do is to prepare. So just like we knew a pandemic was coming and we could have done a lot more to prepare better for it, we have to prepare or at least make some preparations for the possible case of a worst case scenario. So for instance, we need to make sure that we can delete the data when there's an emergency. If you don't have that button, it's just not going to happen. And when things go sour, you're going to be in trouble. So I think we have to have a mindset of preparation and to really use one way to put it, although it's controversial and it would get us into a different debate, is to use the precautionary principle. But the idea is that where we are now is so extreme. It's so extreme that any step in the other direction is going to be very wise. We almost like to be in the other extreme will take a lot of years and a lot of debates and a lot of actions. We can just start walking in the right direction and we can figure out where to stop.
Yeah. I think that's a good wake-up call, and the fact that you're using sort of the example of the pandemic and saying that this could actually then happen with data. And I think your example in comparing World War II in France and the Netherlands, I think hits the point quite well. The next question is from Ruby. I'll shorten it a little bit, but I think it's a really good one, and you can choose to answer it or not. When you talked about discovering something in your research which scared you, but you purposefully left it out of your book, is this something that you're willing to discuss with data experts?
Yeah, so I haven't been able to figure out how to deal with this. In some cases, I've talked about it with people who already knew or who I know very well, and I don't think they're any kind of psychopath who's going to, I don't know, persecute one of their exes. But it's always a gamble. And I prefer to talk about it with people I personally know and kind of trust. But I don't have a perfect formula. Okay,
good. Can I ask another personal question? You mentioned Snowden in the beginning. Do you think, as an initiator for your interest in the subject, but at the same time, you could make an argument that Snowden revealed probably more personal data and information than any individual has ever revealed about everyone, and put some people in danger as well. What's your Snowden take?
I think it's a
hero or villain.
Pretty close to hero. I think it's a conversation that was so important for it to happen, and that it wouldn't have happened without him.
Good. Then the next one is Francesca Bria led the Decode project, which failed because the big companies hired the data scientists they worked for the project, as she pronounced. Why didn't she save these employees? Is there no political volition to save privacy data in this question? This was from Eberhard Schnabel. I don't understand the question, but I'm just a humble political scientist. Okay. Then we move to the next one, which is linked to Hannah Arendt, The Human Condition, writes that modernity is marked by the rise of social realm, invading both the private realm and the public realm, particularly destroying the common way of looking at the world in the public realm. Is the rise of social media companies the final stage of this modernization? Arendt wrote about the diminishing human agency and freedom, the paradox of human powers increasing through technology. but we are less equipped to control the consequences of our actions. So your take on Hannah's thesis?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly relevant. And if Arendt were living now, she would be very concerned, I think, about the present situation. And we have to figure out how to reclaim this common way of looking at the world and this kind of public sphere. And one of the ways that I argue we should do it is to ban personalized content, because at the moment, like just look at this event, right? We are interacting through our screens. And if we don't see the same thing, there's just no hope of us having a constructive conversation.
Yeah, and this is, you know, the parallel realities that we saw, not least in the US elections and actually in the aftermath of the US elections, and the way in which content has been pushed around. Two sets of questions coming here. I'll take one at a time. And this is very clear. I have a 16-year-old son and a 19-year-old daughter. So how can we enhance awareness in a practical way on the topic, also for the youngest generations, which are even more dependent on technologies? My son has Alexa.
Yeah, that's a good question. In some ways, I think young people are more aware than older people, because they're more aware that the digital realm is real. It's not just like a movie. Yeah. And they have grown up with this kind of social pressure. I worry a lot about people who grow up with too much surveillance. I think it changes human psychology in very negative ways, and it can make us too prone to try to fit in with the rest of the group and so on. But one way to make people aware of it is just to give them practical solutions. And one news piece that I came across that really inspired me was about some teenagers who had figured out that they were much better protected if they shared accounts. So they have an Instagram account, and 20 of them use it. They have friends from different parts of the world, and that makes obfuscation really practical and really powerful. And they were worried about universities seeing their profile or possible employers in the future. And this works for them really well. So giving them solutions is part of how you do it. Because if we only give them problems, then it's just easy to think, well, you know, I can't do anything about it. They're going to collect my data anyway. I just want to forget that it's even happening.
That's a very good answer. And that's linked actually to the next question, which comes from Paula Gori, who is working, is the Secretary General of one of our most interesting centers here called EDMO, the European Digital Media Observatory. So basically, we provide projects to fight fake news. And her question is, okay, how do you evaluate the cost of turning off or switching off your gadgets? So it's often difficult, as you are the only one leaving. You're out from the place that all the others are in. I guess you connect this to the collective effort you were mentioning. Do you think interoperability could be structured on a privacy-friendly model, is the question.
That's a really good question. I think it's going to be crucial, because, you know, if you have a conversation with me and Signal and using WhatsApp, it's a lot less of a burden than if I can only have a conversation with people being on Signal. But in general, I think philosophers are particularly prone to this, because there's a problem, or because, you know, the extreme doesn't work very well, we just like dismiss everything in between. It's not that black and white. It's not that, okay, now you have to go offline, don't have a phone, don't have email, don't call your people, your friends and families. Just make an effort, and making an effort makes a huge difference. It's the same with being a vegetarian or not. You know, even if you eat meat once in a while, the fact that you are careful and you try not to eat meat is a lot more different than if you eat meat like 3 times a day, every day. So you don't have to be radical to make a huge difference. And I think that in terms of regulation, interoperability and portability of data is going to be crucial. And just to go back to the previous 2 questions, something very important to inspire young people and to make them conscious is to protect their privacy, to not like surveil them all the time and not ask them more questions than they want to volunteer and so on. At the moment, sometimes we're really surveying young people much more than is healthy, and it's really hard, because at the same time, you know, children need to be surveilled to a certain extent to keep them safe. But I would be very careful in trying to strike the right balance and teaching them that privacy is a human right and they have a right as well to it. And connected to Hannah Arendt's question, we also need to better protect our private sphere. And that means cultivating a culture of privacy as opposed to a culture of exposure. One of the things that has really struck me about these past few weeks with the Capitol incident and all of that is how much we need culture to support good laws. You could have the perfect laws, but if culture doesn't support it, it means squat. People are just going to trample over them. So it's really up to us to start cultivating a culture of privacy and being respectful towards each other.
That's excellent. Carissa, we are running out of time, so I will make one observation and then one final question, and after your answer, hand it over to Daniel to wrap it up. By the way, I liked your example on vegetarianism. Hate to come back to my family, but my son decided that the family should do a vegan January. So the whole family has been vegan, and I have now secretly escaped here to Italy, and perhaps I will deviate a little bit from the line, but we made an effort. There are a couple of interesting ones. These are the observations, then come the questions. Someone says here, we should have a sort of a Greta Thunberg for privacy issues. It'll be an interesting one. I don't know what kind of a school strike he or she would be doing. And then Melina is giving me good advice. I believe in reverse mentorship. So one of our students says, Alex, get rid of Siri and Alexa. They are toxic. So you can see that our master students are a hell of a lot smarter than the professors and the director. Now, the question I will put, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to drop a couple of other questions, but the final question that comes to you is the following. It comes from Greg Dinich. Sorry for the pronunciation. Your book clearly sets out the challenge of the privacy domain. The question arises, what are your top 3 suggestions to the world for decreasing privacy risks? So if you were to give 3 points on how to decrease privacy risks, please give us your 3 points now, and then I'll hand it over to Daniel to wrap it up.
I'll give 4. Sorry, I'm gonna cheat.
Yeah, I remember you have. Yeah. I know which they are. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, ban trades in personal data, ban personalized content and ads, implement fiduciary duties, and improve cybersecurity standards.
There you go. Daniel, can philosophers be this direct and this clear and this communicative, both in writing and in speech? And you're on mute, so be careful. You have to unmute yourself first.
Absolutely. We are dealing with technologies that imply an involuntary politicization of almost all domains of life. Yeah. The individualistic, that is my conclusion of the lecture of your book, Carissa. The individualistic of the private sphere is not a solution. What is private and what is public becomes an eminently political issue. This is what is said in another context can be said here about the battle of data and privacy. It is nothing personal. Carissa Véliz explains it very, very beautifully in this book. Perhaps the most interesting thing of this event, this evening, is to see that your book, Carissa, raised more questions that could be answered in an hour. This is telling about the nature of your book. I hope the next time we will have the opportunity to organize a face-to-face event in Florence, and that we will be able to set up some kind of stable collaboration between our 2 institutions. And please tell John Tasulas, so thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Daniel, for setting this up. Thank you, Carissa, for being here, and also to all the participants. As I said, if you are to read one book on tech at the moment, read this one. And I really, really think it's one of the best books that I've read in a long, long time. The way in which you write it, the issues that you explain, the way in which it captivates. I have an 86-year-old dad, and as I said, a 16-year-old son, and the range for reading this book is right there. You made us understand data in a completely new way, and we appreciate that. Hopefully we can see you here live in Florence with a discussion with our students about the issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I look forward to going to Florence one day.
Great. Have a nice evening, everyone. See you soon. And remember, go and switch yourself from WhatsApp to Signal.